Eastern European Jewry. I think probably that one of the ways one could characterize modern Jewish history as a whole, not just early modern, but modern Jewish as a whole, is the phenomenon of Eastern European Jewry. In the medieval period, Eastern European Jewry was negligible on the whole. And in our period, Eastern European Jewry is also certainly not the central position that it had before the Holocaust, which may be a sign that we're leaving modernity. I think you could very nicely bracket modernity chronologically with the rise and development of Eastern European Jewry as a force in Jewish history. Why is this important here? It's important here because very, very often the discourse of early modern history in general covers a small body of countries in Western and Central Europe: England, France, Germany, Holland, Italy, Spain, Portugal, and that's about it. Yesterday Ronnie took us to China, which was marvellous. In terms of Jewish history, I think it's inconceivable to look at a whole period like early modern Jewish history without looking at Eastern Europe and, of course, the Ottoman Empire. Now, I think for many early modernists, this is taking and stretching their boundaries in a way they would find very, very uncomfortable. It may make the idea of getting some kind of narrative together difficult to the point of impossible. On the other hand, history which doesn't take into account the two largest centres of Jewish life in this period is not really conceivable to my way of thinking. So I was very pleased that I was able to speak in the first session and to see not only Lois but also Yossi, so that we are in fact looking beyond the boundaries of what classic early modernists would call early modern history. Okay, now the text. It's a very difficult thing. I haven't ever been in a workshop like this before, so I don't know what to say and what not to say, how to do it. I'm going to try and do it in very, very broad brushstrokes, interspersed with textual comments, which is really weird, but that's what I'm going to do anyway. Feel free at any stage to stop me if you've got something to add, to change, to say, whatever. It's supposed to be an open conversation. I'll start, jump in when you want to. As I said, medieval Eastern European Jewry is not a major phenomenon in Jewish history, certainly after the Khazars. And if we talk about classical Eastern European Jewry, which is Polish-Lithuanian Jewry, until the mid-15th century, it really is a very small body of people, very, very largely of Western origin. They're settlers invited from Germany. The first privilege granted to Polish Jews is the very famous privilege of Bolesław from 1264, which is, as is well known, a copy, not 100%, but very close copy of privileges that Jews had received in Central Europe in different places at about the same time, in the middle of the 13th century. The Polish historian Meir Balaban even tried to trace the path of migration of Jews from Central Europe to Eastern Europe by following the route of this privilege. I'm not sure it's a brilliant idea, but if it's a brilliant idea, I'm not sure it works. The next century, King Kazimierz the Great, who's a great figure of Jewish folklore, who had a Jewish lover by the name of Esther, at least according to the folklore, granted the privilege again, gave the Jews more rights. The Jews were in fact invited to Poland, not as Jews as such, but as part of a policy of urban development. The Polish king in this period was trying to pull together his country from a set of princeling states, put it together to one country. He had no urban markets. He was very interested in developing his towns. So he turned to the urban development of Germany to his west, the German lands to his west, and invited settlers, which is to say Christians and Jews, German-speaking, who came and set up towns under his tutelage, of course, on the Polish lands. This meant that the towns in Poland were essentially German-speaking. Polish urban records through the late Middle Ages into the 16th century are very often in German. The language spoken by the burghers was German. The legal status of the towns was very closely based on German Magdeburg urban law. And the Jews were part of this phenomenon. In a minute, we'll look at one of the privileges they had, perhaps the most favourable privileges they got in the Middle Ages, and I'll show one or two of the points. One thing that I think comes out of this straight away, however, is that as the Jews and the non-Jews in the German-speaking Polish towns developed, there was a process of Polonization, which was a slow process, but it took a period of time, which swept over the towns. And as time went on, the towns moved to Polish. The burghers became Polish burghers, in the true sense of the word. Polish became the lingua franca in the towns. This was a form of Polonization. The Jews, on the other hand, underwent a slightly different cultural development, which is very important to note. They did not abandon the German they spoke when they came into the towns. They also underwent a form of Polonization. The German that the Eastern European Jews spoke was not the same as the Judeo-German that was spoken in Germany. It's a different, not an entirely different language, but it had a whole different linguistic strata. So I'm starting off by pointing out, on the one hand, a different form of cultural development. On the other hand, not portraying the Jews as totally separate. They came as part of a broad movement of settlement, and they underwent processes of Polonization just in a different way from their surroundings. The question of language, Jewish language, is very important in the early modern period, which is really why I made all this discussion. Because it's not only the Jews of Eastern Europe that have this process of speaking a language which is different from their environment. That's a phenomenon you see in the Ottoman Empire. Ronnie talked about the Portuguese Jews continuing to speak Portuguese and not adopting Dutch, although they did rather more quickly than Eastern European Jews did. But it's an interesting cultural phenomenon, which is new, I think, in the early modern period, of the Jews not speaking a dialect of the language of their environment. They are not speaking Judeo-German, Judeo-Spanish, Judeo-Arabic. They're speaking a different language, a separate language. And that's not just, I mean, Yiddish is the most well known, but it's by no means the only phenomenon. And I think it's a general phenomenon in early modern Jewish history. And I think it's worth thinking about in much more depth than has been thought about until today.
The phenomenon of the preservation of language, which I agree with you, is a characteristic of this period. I mean, we were talking about last night whether it's only of this period or whether it's a new phenomenon. But could you argue in Poland that it's a function of numbers?
No, I don't think so. Because, if you talk about the demographics of Polish Jewry, in the Middle Ages, it's a negligible group of people. Through the 16th century, it's not a huge number. The real spurt of the growth of the Jews is late 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, and even quicker in the 19th century, by which time these are patterns that are already set.
Well, is it also perhaps to some extent a function of marriage, that after a few generations, or for whatever reasons, it was possible for members of the German colonial town populations who were continuing to marry with Polish Catholics?
Well, I mean, I'm sure there's a certain amount of intermarriage, I mean, in that sense, but I'm not sure that process is the process which is connected with intermarriage. It's a question of cultural involvement, not necessarily familiar, on a familial basis, but in terms of economic, cultural, social.
Are you suggesting that the German colonial non-Jewish communities remain a distinctive population while adopting Polish?
A distinctive population? I don't quite understand.
Well, genealogically.
No, I couldn't answer that question.
Sorry, I certainly couldn't.
I don't.
Polonized, I think they are absorbed. I mean, the last names sometimes are retain the Germanic character, but I do not think.
But is it just a function of time and contact with Polish culture, or is it a function of intermarriage? I'm worried about the question of intermarriage because of the structure of society, which intermarriage is slightly problematic. Yeah, not sure.
Well, by the late 17th century, various groups had assimilated into Polishness: the Scots, Italians, Germans. These groups, who earlier were immigrant groups, in many ways parallel to the Jews as scarcely British, but eventually they Polonized, and perhaps analogously, the Sephardic Jews, who were in small numbers, but still distinctive community in the 16th century, also by the late 17th century had Ashkenazi.
Right.
So that
Okay. No, I mean it's certainly a phenomenon that happens. The question that was raised is what's the motive that drives it?
Perhaps it's a cultural.
My feeling is it's a cultural interaction.
So you have the Christian, you still have the religious, so to speak, division, but you have the Polish culture begins to develop after the mid-16th century.
Yeah. Okay.
Because before that you don't have. First Polish books are published late, towards the after mid-16th century. So you don't really have native Polish culture until later 16th century. So that's why you have the sort of the gradual Polonization. Was here you have the Ashkenazi culture that exists, and then you have the minority acculturating to them.
I think the pattern I would look more is, I think, in terms of in these terms, in terms of majority-minority, which has a certain function of intermarriage, but I wouldn't focus in on it.
Yeah. I just wanted to ask you whether you gave any thought, I don't know if this was mentioned before, to the fact that maybe Ashkenazi Jews have, from their medieval heritage, built in kind of anti-Christian or some kind of cultural constraint that actively prevent them from adopting that culture in the same way as other minorities might.
On one level, obviously, you'd argue that, but I wasn't necessarily talking about adopting Polish culture. The point I was making was adopting the Polish language, which is a different point.
And beyond that, it only pushes the question back, because obviously they're bringing German with them. Right? In other words, they've already absorbed an outside language. They're not speaking Hebrew to each other. They already speak another language. The question is, why do they keep that language?
Well, they didn't go from Hebrew to German.
Yeah. Okay. But it begs the question.
Okay.
I would like to relate this to the text.
Okay.
To bring it back, because I really think we're going off on the technicality here. And what I'm wondering in terms of our evidence is, let me bring you something from the only thing that I know, which is Italian Jews. And we find the Italian Jewish notaries writing in Hebrew and writing in Italian at the same time, actually. Different notaries, different kind of documents. So that if we're talking about what we're seeing from these people and what we're writing, of course, Italian Jews are writing in Hebrew too. Different, that is, rabbinic Hebrew and different kinds of material and whatever. So that maybe what we would do well to do is try to go back to the documents that you brought here, which have nothing to do with language, and try to say, I mean, comparing the two different things. This is something that I played games with over the course of the last 10, 20, etc. years. Where is the one document different from another? Where can we extrapolate from the language, the hard language of the document, which can be very deceptive, the language of these documents, and suggest where Jews might feel or not feel comfortable and where they might or might not adopt Polish. I'm sure they were using Polish when they wrote the Testaments. I mean, they had to learn it. They heard it in the streets.
Okay, let's do that then. In which case, let's go and look at the first text, which is the second text that's printed here, the Extended Privilege of 1453. Assuming that you've all read it, and if you haven't, it isn't that long, so it won't take you too much time to look at it. I'm going to point up 5 or 6 points here in this text, which I think are important for understanding Jewish experience. This I brought as the apogee of medieval Polish Jewish experience, although, no, I'll leave it like that. Okay. First of all, notice in the 5th line, it reads that before Our Majesty appeared as delegates our Jews from the lands of Great Poland and related. This is a privilege that is not granted unilaterally, it is granted after a process of negotiation. The Jews came to the king and negotiated with him for rights. Second, a bit further down the same paragraph, it talks about that the Jews claim they really only want their old rights back, which had been burnt in a fire. The fire was in Poznan in 1447, the date of the king's coronation. This actually is a motif that appears in more than one privilege. The Jews, when wanting privileges, quite often come and say, we lost our old privilege in a fire or in the wars, and we'd like a copy of it. And of course, they're not asking for a copy. Not asking for a copy, they're asking for different and better rights. And this is exactly what happens here. What we don't have, this is not a copy of the privileges the Jews had enjoyed previously. This is an extended privilege. It's very smart political maneuvering. The Jews are very good at it. Okay, the other thing which appears 2 or 3 times here is, of course, the Jews are viewed as part of the royal treasury. Okay, this is a Polish version of the Serbi Kamerai. The Jews are referred to here as our Jews, Judei Nostri. The very, very close relationship with the king. Notice in number 6, the Jews are part of the treasury, and that gives them more negotiating power with the local authorities. If the captain, the starosta or the voivoda wants to pay the Jews have to agree. There has to be a process of negotiation on a local level because the Jews are protected by the king. The 7th thing mentions that Jewish discipline, Jewish communal discipline, is supported by the state. Okay, this is a well-worn idea, but Jewish autonomy is based on power borrowed from outside the Jewish community. Jewish communal discipline is not simply a function of Jewish tradition, Jewish communal tradition, but in fact bases itself of necessity, and I say that advisedly, on outside power. So when we talk about Jewish autonomy or Jewish communal development, have to bear in mind this nexus. Moshe has written about this on more than one occasion. There's that. Finally, the top paragraph on page 4, the Jews who take noble property on mortgage. It's a way of lending money. In Poland, Jewish moneylenders would lend money on land, take the land as a mortgage. And then this very strange thing that says that any Jew who has done that should not be made to ride out to war or to make any financial contribution on the basis of the land he holds, because he's already paying the king the money. This is another very interesting Eastern European phenomenon. The Jews, by mortgaging noble property, and later on, as Moshe wrote in his book, The Lord's Jews, and I dealt with in my work, by leasing land, by taking an arrenda on land, the Jews actually take on some aspects of nobility. It has to be made clear in this thing that the Jews they don't have the same duties. They're holding the land is theirs through the mortgage, but they're not to be sent out to war. They don't have the same duties.
Okay. Just to explain the last part, because these Jews are part of our church.
Yeah.
You understand that they're holding a mortgage. I still don't understand exactly what's happening.
Okay.
Essentially, I understand that a Jew gave a loan to a noble or somebody to help him out.
Right.
He took the land as a mortgage.
Right.
Okay, so the Jew now sits on land. He may or may not have use of that land. The mortgage doesn't necessarily give you the right to use the land. But because of that, because he's holding the land with mortgage, he can't go out.
He can't be made. I mean, no. The duties which pertain to holding the land do not fall on him because he already has a different set of duties as a Jew. But it's a blurring of a boundary, which is interesting.
Well, and the war duties were only for the militaries.
These duties were.
Yeah, here.
Equitarian.
So here is a distinction between the Jews and the...
Right. Yeah, but it's a distinction that has to be made clear in the economic and social situation of Eastern Europe.
I think this document is a good example of the possible pitfalls of legal documents. Right. First of all, this business about the Jews being Serbi Kamerai. So, in 1453, it seemed pretty natural to say that, except that Weinberg points out that in many ways they weren't classic Serbi Kamerai. And I think the question is still open as to exactly what the relationship is between that concept and the status of Jews in Poland.
The question is open in general. I mean, it's not just a Polish thing.
I mean, there are many debates on exactly it.
This point that you said that this is a fact of negotiation is something that I think people usually ignore. And especially in this case, where a year after he issued this privilege, it was challenged, and he had to revoke it. So it shows that this is a dynamic process of negotiation currently going on, and the significance of the document is not so clear. Just I'm not trying to imply that you were saying that.
No, okay, absolutely right. I mean, nothing is ever static.
A great example of how documents the beginning of the conquest and at the end.
I want to sort of respond. First of all, these documents are not new. There's a formula. When you're reading the formula of the documents and reading the documents, you got to ask what the one before it looked like, the one before that, the one before that.
Can I add something here? Specifically with regard to the idea of some recognition of or some blurring of boundaries because of the use of equitate, sort of picking up on the idea that these things are formulaic and that these things, it's not just that they're formulaic in the sense that I think Kenny was suggesting as one extreme. That is, they may be simply a string of formulae, and before you want to know that, you have to know what the history of the formulae. But I would go beyond that. These things are, after all, ultimately statements of jurisdictional authority, right? And too often in dealing with Jewish history, we don't realize that jurisdictional aspect of non-Jewish history or non-Jewish authority. So we talk about the state or the this, and we forget the fact that what's going on here is different groups are fighting over who has the right to rule. The Jews are only one part of that. In this particular case, Jews own land, or they hold mortgages on land. They hold mortgages on land, and there is an automatic set of obligations that derive from the land. They're not personal. They're not Gavri, they're okay. So they don't apply. Well, one second. Let's make this argument. There may be vagueness as to who has the right to own the land, but in fact, a situation has come up because of the Jews that has blurred not their status. It's actually created a problem in the issue of jurisdiction or in the issue of the definition of a right, which is part of this kind of right system that is not absolute, but rather negotiated. Now, when he says here then, just because Jews hold the mortgage, they cannot be forced to ride out. That doesn't mean that anybody expected the Jew to ride out, or that there ever was a case that the Jew rode out. All that it means is that he's using the word that normally applies to the land. And then he says, not only can you not be allowed to go out, not only can you not be forced to ride, which of course, but in addition, you also can't be forced to pay for it. One might have thought, right, well, but nec aliquid pro expeditione dare, right? In other words, he does not have to give anything towards the owner of the land.
Just put a period there and then go furthermore on that.
Yeah, so what he means is the owner of the mortgage, the guy who mortgaged the land can't force the Jew to pay. The Jew pays for going to war to the king directly.
Yeah. No, I don't think that's the issue here. I don't think that's what's going on. I think what they're saying is this. Normally, if you have a piece of land, along with the piece of land comes certain military obligations. Jews who hold the mortgage, and therefore theoretically are obligated to fulfill those military obligations, they will not apply to them because the Jew is exempt from this system. The Jew does not owe things. It's true the land owes it, but you can't make the Jew pay. Finished.
I'm not sure whether it's tied to the land per se. I think it's tied to the knighthood, to the group of knights. I mean, from the Middle Ages, the sort of feudal arrangement, and they are outside of it. It doesn't mean that someone else didn't own land before that. So I'm not sure how that it is tied. Maybe, but I'm not.
The question of the feudal connection between noble status, holding land and fighting, Okay, that's a triangle, okay, which is broken here, okay, because you have, and it's not clear. I mean, it's not that you have to hold the land, therefore you go to war. You are a noble, you hold land, you go to war. This is what I was trying to say. The Jews have got into this triangle in a certain way, and it's confusing. It's just confusing. That clear boundary, and the Polish nobility, starting from the very next year, as Moshe said, starting from 54, are working very hard to actually make the boundaries much, much more clear, that only nobles can hold land and only nobles go to war, and only nobles decide when to go to war. That's something that becomes clearer starting from the very next year. However, at this stage, and we'll see it in another way later on, there is, I feel, the Jew is somehow found himself in a situation where the boundaries between him and the non-Jewish world have changed. They're somewhat blurred. Then, as Moshe says, it's a question of negotiation. Then someone comes along and says, no, absolutely, this is not what we want. We're not here to have the Jews become nobles and start going to war. This is not what we're into, and we'll do something else. Yeah, but the point I was trying to say is that these boundaries are subject to negotiation and they're subject to change. And we see them from the other end of history as something very clear and very rigid, and in fact they're not as clear and as rigid as all that. That's really what I was trying to say. Yeah, Elliot.
I just want to pick up, both on the subject of Jews riding out to war and also on the, I would say, methodological issue raised by Moshe earlier about legal texts as we might call cultural constructs, even though he didn't use exactly that terminology. Namely, and here I'm asking Ed because I don't know the answer. What if you didn't have this text excluding Jews from riding out to war? Would they have done so anyway? That is, would they have been required to do so? My suspicion is that, and I'll pick up on this later this afternoon, is that Jews were regarded as being unsuitable for going to war anyway, and that what this text is doing, and again I'm saying it's only from a suspicion, I don't really know, is using a legal, not so much a legal fiction, but using legal discourse to make official something that is sensed intuitively. That is to say, of course Jews won't go to war, because Jews are not people we want fighting for us, or they're unsuitable for war, or all sorts of assumptions. Again, I'm not arguing that, I'm asking that, but you can say, no, you're wrong. No. And in 1432, 2,000 Jews were sent to war. I don't know. But all I'm saying is that I'm wondering whether this is one of those instances whereby the legal language is used to couch a non-legal assumption in legal language.
I agree with it. The only question I ask me is, why do you need to do it?
Why you need to do it?
I agree with it. There were Jews who fought, by the way. We do know about Jewish soldiers here and there. No, I don't think that anyone in the 15th century wanted or expected the Jews to go to war.
Right. And then the question is, why do they need then to say it in legal language?
Exactly. And that's why I'm thinking that an ambiguity has arisen, and it has to be dealt with. I mean, that's really all I'm saying. Trying to show the ambiguities of this life.
Right. And one thing that I'm suggesting, not so much the purpose of this text, but throwing it out because we may come out later, is that sometimes legal texts are artificial ways of justifying things you don't have other language for. For example, they can't just say, of course Jews are unsuitable for war. It's in sort of in some ways a racialist construction, and there is not yet a language.
Although I would actually argue that you could read this not as a Christian stipulation at all, but as a Jewish stipulation. To say the Jews are saying, we haven't got the mortgage of the land. I don't expect the Jews were terribly concerned they were going to be forced to ride out to war, but they were rather more concerned that the guy holding the mortgage would say, well, the guy owning the land would say, you've got the mortgage, you pay.
Well,
and the Jews didn't want
to be devil's advocate, you can argue that they own the land, and then someone argues, well, they should also go to war. And this is a legal way of sanctioning something that is uncomfortable.
And I'm arguing just the opposite of that. That they knew they would go to war, but they had to somehow couch it in legal language so that it's sort of taken care of that.
Could I respond, Elliot?
But I think what you said a moment ago was somewhat problematic. You said they wouldn't, that was something that couldn't be said, that Jews are unsuitable for war. Does that sound like a racialist assumption?
No.
Perhaps it was understood?
No. I said it couldn't be said, meaning they did not yet have the language of race in which to say it.
The last paragraph, line 4.
Line 4, where Adams translated as one would expect, and desired that the Jews thus should recognize that they have received the relief.
Right.
I like that for consulatus. Relief meaning in the sense of having privilege.
Right.
But agnostant, I think, means more consent. In other words, the Jews have, it's two-sided. The Jews have to consent to this thing somewhere along the line. It's not just that he's given them and recognize my bounty, but they have to accept all this status that he wants them somehow or other to accept the direct relationship with him. And that's just my guess.
And is that formulaic?
It's very formulaic.
Yes. So
it's exceedingly formulaic, but that's part of the formula, establishing this direct sense, because kingdoms are established beginning from the third. See, I once read a book by a guy named King Kazimierz called The King's Two Bodies, and I haven't been able to put it down in 45 years, and because I think he's right. The treasury, the fiscus, is the permanent part of the kingdom, the crown. How the hell are we going to keep these Jews? Because we really have no reason. So let's just say they're attached to the permanent part of the kingdom. You can't alienate them. But somehow or other he wants them to recognize. This is just like yes, that in other words, that there is a, if you're talking about give and take, this is part of it. It's just like with the condotta in Italy. Well, we let you come in, but 10 years you got to keep that bank up. You can't walk out when you made your profits. You can't, when the market's up, you can't sell the shares.
I just want to say one point about Moshe's point about this being a negotiation, which does ring true to me that it's not only a negotiation on the Jews' part, it's also a negotiation on the nobles and king's part. And when you said the Jews were good negotiators, that they said, well, we lost this document in a fire and we want a copy. We have to remember who's writing this. It's the king. No. So I don't think it's that something has been pulled over them. What they feel uncomfortable also, or they're trying to present these new terms as a copy when they're really not.
Right. No, I think it's agreed on both sides. Yeah. Right. Yes, that's another formulaic way of granting new rights in a situation where that isn't necessarily the best thing to do.
We have no evidence of anything prior.
Yeah. Okay, let's try and move on, because this in fact was just the first course and I got the main course to come in and time is moving. Okay. This, as Moshe pointed out, is the high point of the Jews' negotiations with the king in the Middle Ages. In the very next year, as part of the Polish War against the Teutonic Order, the nobles stage a rebellion. They demand and receive from the king in the town of Nieszawa a whole range of rights, the last of which is the cancellation of the 1453 privilege, so that in actual legal terms it didn't have a very long life. Okay? It's a clear sign that the nobles are attacking royal privileges in every way that they can. As I say, the Jews are low on their list of priorities, but they reserve the right to decide on new laws. They reserve the right to decide who is called to the army and when. And it's the beginning of a process which marks out Polish history in general through the early modern period of the decline of central royal power in favour of a highly decentralized noble system of government. As time went on, the nobles took to themselves, to their estates, more and more rights. In 1519, they claimed absolute power over the peasants on their estates. In 1539, they claimed to themselves absolute jurisdiction over the Jews living on their estates. And running through the 1560s, they took absolute power over the towns on their estates. Which is to say, they cut the link between their subjects and the royal subjects. Which is very, very important. As far as the Jews are concerned, this is crucial because the link that we talked about here of Servi Camarae, Judei Nostri, however we want to define this in Polish terms or in European terms, however we want to define it at all, is no longer the case. there is no legal connection between the Jews of Poland as a body and the king, the central authority. Each local organization has to deal with local powers, with noble power in its vicinity. Whether the power actually is in its vicinity, or as Moshe also showed in his study of the Czartoryskis and Sieniackis, a long way off. But that's where power resides, not with the king. Now, in terms of the Jews' legal status, this was a major revolution, because this kind of privilege that they had, that the king gave, could no longer be defended in local courts, because the king no longer had power, particularly in noble-owned estates, but even in the royal towns, where the nobles played important roles as functionaries. These privileges lost their power. And so, starting with the assumption of the new king in 1548, we see a wave of Jewish communities requesting and receiving community privileges. Okay. It's a move in the general legal structure of the Jews. Okay. Legal structure in the Middle Ages is based on three basic forms of privilege. There are general privileges covering an entire country or region. There are local privileges dealing with a particular place, and there are individual privileges. Okay. What marks out Polish Jewry, I think, from all the other European Jewries in this period, is the importance of the local community privilege as the basis for Jewish existence. It's not to say there weren't in other places. We know some of the big towns in the 16th century, in the empire in the 16th, 17th century, still have privileges. But it's by no means as important. We also know that individual Polish Jews had privileges. That also happened. And kings continued to give general privileges. Each new king gave the Polish Jews a general privilege. It just wasn't that significant. The community privilege I'm using here is a metaphor for the nexus between the Jews and the nobles, which becomes very, very important as time goes on. Another thing that happens in 1453, by the way, the time of this privilege, is the fall of Constantinople, which is of major importance in European and Polish history because it changes the trade patterns, it changes trade routes. Poland, which had previously made a lot of money as being on the east-west trade route, no longer could do that. Its trade started to move north-south. 16th century is a time where the Dutch penetrate the Baltic, and so that whole new trade route is opened up for Poland. It's absolutely crucial in understanding Polish history and Polish Jewish history, for that matter. And it's just, we have to remember when we're doing Jewish history that these sort of big things are very, very important, even on a very small level, and I'll try and show that in a word towards the end. Okay. These changes meant that Poland and the Polish legal system, the Polish society and Polish economy, more to the point, had to undergo a series of changes and redevelopments. It's a new world in the 16th century. And following 1648, which is the reorganization of Central and Western Europe following the Peace of Westphalia, and the collapse of the Polish economy following the uprising of Khmelnytsky, this is another total revolution in society and economy, and Poland has to reconstruct itself and rebuild its economy. And this is, I'm saying Moshe and Gershon Hundert and Jakob Goldberg and all these people have said this before me, but I'll just repeat it again because it bears repeating. As the nobles became more powerful, and particularly the small group of highest nobles became more powerful, they needed to buttress their power with increased income in order to run courts, in order to run political organizations, not formal ones, but informal ones, and to sustain the kind of lifestyle that the high nobility in that period needed. And one of the strategies that they used was to reorganize the economy of their estates, to make their estates more cash-bearing, which involved greater intensivity in the use of grain and their monopoly on the sale of alcohol. So you see huge investment in taverns, and the Jews are used as part of this process, which is to say, as I argued in my research, that if you want to understand the development of the Polish state and the Polish nobility, you have to understand the nobility's Jewish policy. This is a clear policy of using the Jews to reorganize the economy of the magnate estates. And how does it come into how can we get into some kind of focus? I think if we look at the privilege from Jampol, and I point out some of the things, we may be able to get some idea of what I'm trying to say, and the consequences of this change. I've done this in very, very broad strokes, and I apologise. It's really very difficult to stay within the framework of time and say these things in a coherent way. The longer I work, the less coherent I become. Okay, let's look at the Jampol privilege. I brought this privilege, though it was published by Jakob Goldberg in his collection of privileges, because I found it. In my archival researches, I found it and I gave it to him and he published it, so it's mine. Okay, 7 points. First of all, it is when we talk about the negotiations for this privilege, we see that it's the Kahal and the burghers of the town have come and are negotiating the Jewish privilege. Which is very interesting, because on the whole we tend to see the Kahal and the burghers as in conflict. Whereas here, in the situation of the early 18th century, Kahal and burghers are together negotiating rights for the Jewish community. The burghers, in what sense, who are they? They are the non-Jewish residents of the town.
The residents or the leadership?
Undoubtedly, the Kahal means the community board and the burghers means the community council. Absolutely. 1. 2. Next paragraph. Okay. Why is this being given? Because there has been a war and there is reconstruction going on. The motor for this privilege is reconstruction, rebuilding. And like we saw in the first privilege, rebuilding doesn't mean creating what was before. Rebuilding means creating a new economic system. It's not totally different from what came before, but it's not exactly the same as it. Okay? You see something which reminds us of raison d'etat. In order to do his rebuilding, he wants settlement. He doesn't mind who it is. Although actually there are such favourable terms for Jewish settlement in this period that many of these small towns have a large proportion or even a majority of Jews in them. This is the classic period of shtetl formation. This is what's happening here, where the Jews are such favoured settlers that they will come in greater numbers than non-Jews and enjoy more rights. I can talk about that at huge length, but I shan't. Next paragraph. The basis for the Jews' settlement. Question of vodka and alcohol and the arenda. In the period before 1648, certainly on royal estates, the sale of alcohol had brought in a certain percentage, it could be quite low, 2 or 3% of the state income. By the 18th century, it could be 20%, 25%, and even higher. You're talking about a tenfold and greater growth of the importance of this form of income. And this form of income is very, very largely, if not exclusively, in Jewish hands. Okay, the next thing you noted, free trade in crafts for the Jews. I mean, it's a very small place. There are about 500 Jews at the end of the century, and probably not many more Christians, although I couldn't find the actual number of Christians despite looking. Then we have the next paragraph, which is stunning, actually. I've never seen it anywhere else. The election of city councillors, it says, should be held in the following manner. The podstarosti, the noble manager of Jampol, must choose one on behalf of the castle, which is to say, the lord's representative. The Jewish Kahal, a second, while the burghers are to choose 2. Okay, which is to say that on the city council sits a Jew. And this is off the wall. This is not every place has this. However, it is. Sorry? No. It is a sign of a phenomenon that I think is very, very important in these places. Which is to say that the burghers and the Jews are treated as 2 parallel sets of urban settlers. Okay? The town has its own privileges, what makes it a town. It has a privilege which describes the rights and duties of the townspeople. And the community, Jewish, has its own privilege which grants the rights and duties of the Jews. Which means that effectively and legally you are dealing with 2 parallel groups of people. Now there may be a social hierarchy. The burghers here have 2 councillors, the Jews only have 1 councillor. But in terms of structure, you're talking about two parallel groups.
Adam?
Yeah.
Can I interrupt for a second? Is there a separate charter to Jews for Jampol that we have?
This is the Jewish.
Well, this
is a non-Jew. I don't have a...
No. You said, and I'm not quibbling on what you said, but you said, well, it's clear that there are two groups, right? Each of them recognized, and if I understand this document is talking about the manner in which the city council, this paragraph, in which the city council will be formed, granted the Jews are there.
Right.
This document presumes that there is already a kahal in Jampol.
There's also a city council in Jampol.
Right. So in other words, this document is a working out, as you said, of a new arrangement or whatever, or something, but it assumes that the Jews are already there. This is not an invitation to Jews to come. So what I'm asking,
it's not only an invitation to Jews.
No, it isn't. It is not an invitation to Jews to come.
But if you read the second paragraph, that is part of what he wants.
No, I know he wants more, but they're already there.
Yes, right.
So what I'm asking is there any? Do we know anything about the earlier group?
This is the earliest provision.
Okay.
There is no earlier provision.
Is there an earlier Christian church?
The amount known about Jampol before the late 17th century is almost negligible. Okay. We know that there was a wooden church there built in the 1640s. But beyond that, we don't have any knowledge. I haven't gone to the archives to dig it out either. Okay, this leads me to an important point, and I will try and go as quick as I can. The question of difference. Okay, are the Jews different or are they the same? Or in fact, are those categories we want to use at all in discussion? In a society which is built not on the principles of equality, but on the principles of difference, where the Jews are separatist states, where there are separatist states, society is founded on difference. You are a nobleman, you are a townsperson, you are a peasant, you are a clergyman. Being different was not different. Being different was the norm. So in fact, you could go further than that. You could say being the same is a sign of being different is a sign of integration. In order to integrate into early modern society, you have to be different. Ooh, crikey. That's an oxymoron, not to say a moron. But I think it's very important for understanding the Jews' relationship with the burghers here. These are two separate groups. There's a hierarchy between them, but they are parallel. They function in the same ways. They do the same things. They have rights and duties which are different, but in their difference are the same. It's early in the morning for this, I tell you. Now, it doesn't mean that there's not intergroup hostility. Plenty of intergroup hostility. Jampol is the site of a big blood libel in the 1750s. One of the people who suffer from it actually goes off to Rome to get a papal bull in order to bring back to Poland and put in the archives there. So it doesn't mean there's no intergroup hostility. But that doesn't mean that there's no intergroup hostility between nobles and burghers, or burghers and peasants. There's that too. Different forms, different signs, different intensities, same structures. If you look on the structural level here, the Jews form an integral part of society. This means that intermarriage is nothing strange. Different customs, different dress, different culinary habits do not mark the Jews out. I mean, it does mark them out, but everyone is marked out that way.
You mean the absence of intermarriage is not strange?
I beg your pardon. Tell you, it's early.
Revisionism has its limits.
It's early. And I think it's very important if we want to look and understand what early modern Jews are, how early modern Jewry functions, is to do away with the kind of conceptual ideas of what integration is and what cultural connections are, in favour of something which is rather more based in the reality in which the Jews lived. And once you've gone down this road of seeing difference as integration, then the boundaries between the two groups have to be reanalyzed. What crosses and what doesn't cross? How is something the same in two different groups? Because the same idea can be refracted in two different groups in two different ways. Exactly the point I just made, which is to say the same phenomena in different groups can be refracted differently. You can either concentrate on the different refraction of the phenomena and see different groups and use modern categories of analysis of what social integration is and social interaction is and come out with a picture of Polish Jews that we all know and love. Okay? Or you can try and find a different form of analysis which will enable us to understand, I think, rather more deeply what ties the junctures and disjunctures between Jewish and non-Jewish society. Now, I'm well aware that I have focused rather more on the junctures than the disjunctures, but I've got a feeling the disjunctures are better known to my audience than the junctures, maybe. This is not, I have obviously, as you've all noticed, apart from a quick reference to a blood libel, missed out the question of religion and religious hierarchy. But I've done that on purpose, and I think it's important to try and understand the junctures as much as the disjunctures. And the question of Jews and Christians is not something that has to be belaboured to any great extent. Yes, Bernie.
I have come across very similar kinds of phenomena approximately 100 years or 110 years earlier in Italy. That is, I can find parallel examples of groups clearly represented, negotiated, having some kind of rights in the governance of the city and so forth and so on. My question to you is this. Is there a specific thing you can point to? I mean, you talk generally about a restructuring of the economy in Poland after breakdown of central authority, certainly, or I don't know if breakdown's the right word, but you know what I mean. Yeah. Or we could talk about changes in the economy and things like that, certainly the devastation of 30 Years' War. Okay, but having said all of that, is there something specific that allows this to happen in Jampol in 1711? Or is this a phenomenon that is widespread? Is it a function of the idea that the Jews themselves have changed? Or is it simply, do you see it simply as a feature of the changing economy?
Well, you can look at it on a number of different levels. I mean, what I'm trying to do here, what I've been trying to do using this example and this specific historical context in order to explicate a phenomenon that you can see in other places and other times. And the study of Jewish history is peppered. When I started going down this road for other works that I've written, there are so many articles in Jewish history about the parallel phenomena of Christian development and Jewish development. Hasidei Ashkenaz, Orbach has one about the writing of the Tour as being influenced by Spanish models. And you go through it, and no one has ever said any more than these are parallel phenomena that happened by coincidence. Well, I don't believe in coincidence very much. I mean, I can believe in one coincidence, but when you see these kind of coincidences running through Jewish history, and if you found the same thing in what you've been looking at there, it strengthens what I have to say. So the question then is, how can you understand it? Well, I'm not here at this stage to pontificate about Jewish history in general. I know Jampol in 1711.
No, I'm asking about Jampol. In other words, I'm strengthened by what you find. What I'm asking you is there a specific to this circumstance that made the phenomenon come to the fore in Jampol in 1711? Or do you see this charter as a sample of what's going on all over Poland for the last 50 years?
I would. Yeah, certainly. I think this is emblematic. This is not. I mean, we're not talking just about Jampol. Jampol is an example. In the published collection of provisions we have, there are about 150. I would guess that if you went digging around, you could find at least another 150. And they don't all tell exactly the same story, but you could go down the same road with many, many of them.
Would you say this point of having a Jew be a member of the city council, is that emblematic?
No.
That surprised you in this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an extreme example of what happens in the situation of the kind of integration I was trying to describe. Because that kind of integration can lead to another blurring of boundaries. But this is totally extreme and not, I don't think you find this, have you seen this anywhere else, Moshe?
Well, people...
One other example.
See, people are surprised when they know that, forgive me, Bernie, for saying Livorno before you do, but in 1780, and that's trumpeted as, it is significant. So I find this very early, very interesting that it's so early. And when you said you had a lot of examples from 110 years earlier, on this point specifically, or were you speaking more generally?
In fact, of a similar thing, we're running out of time, and we want to make sure that you have enough time.
It's okay.
I think it can be continued. Of this point, sort of, but I think it's the phenomenon that's quite remarkable.
No. Okay, let me sum up 5 points, and then I will stop. Okay.
3 minutes.
3 minutes, less than that. What can you extrapolate possibly from here to more general early modern phenomena? 1. Economic penetration. The early modern period is a period of huge economic penetration. We don't have mercantilism in Poland, although there are quite clear similarities, but you don't have the ideology of mercantilism. However, you do see economic penetration to the point that the Jews are a structural part of the economy and political economy of the country where they live. This leads to 2, a significant empowerment of the Jews. 3, I talked about the points of social integration on the basis of difference. Okay? The Jews do have a separate cultural development, but it does not necessarily mean that they are not integrated into society. Once you look at integration in terms of difference, you can start to see connections between non-Jewish and Jewish culture that you couldn't otherwise see. And I think that's a field for examination. I started to scratch the surface of that. There's a lot of work to be done, and I think it's very, very interesting. Not just in the places where you know you're going to see it in Italy, but in Poland where you really don't expect to see it. And
do you think this is unique to the early modern period?
I think it's emphasized in the early modern period. You could probably think, I'd have to think about that in more depth. But I could not. Another thing I didn't talk about very much is the subordination of communal institutions. We think, because the time ran out, the Lord ran the community. The community was on paper autonomous. It borrowed its authority from the Lord. He interfered in this and that way how it ran. Now, the classical way of looking at that is modernization, the destruction of the corporations, centralization of the state. This isn't happening in Poland. There are no corporations in Poland because there's no Roman law. There is no centralization of the state, so that isn't happening. And in fact, I would argue, and on the basis of just my opinion at this stage, that with the explosion in the development of Jewish communities in the early modern period, where they become much more sophisticated and much more highly developed, comes their adoption into states, certainly into the Polish state administrative system and probably elsewhere, which means that they are always being used in the early modern period as a tool of integration. And what changes is not the attitude to the community, but the form of integration that's being sought. I haven't said that very clearly. You can ask me about it in a minute. Finally, another matter didn't come up, the growth of social margins. Jews leaving towns, going to settle in smaller towns and in taverns, creates what Ronnie was talking about yesterday, a space for the development of new forms, of a rather freer development of Jewish cultural identities. Okay, so it's not the same as the kind of inter-religious thing that Ronnie was talking about, but in the idea of a greater space is important. Methodologically, and finally, as you've heard, I've tried to avoid the dichotomy of internal and external Jewish development. I don't think we can anymore try to understand the development of Jewish culture on its own terms as an internal thing. We have to see it in its relation to the outside world and what's happening there. To be extreme, as I often do, you could easily argue that had Constantinople not fallen in 1453, the Hasidic movement as we know it today would not have developed. I'll stop there.
That was a finger.
Well,
that was a finger.